At 28, I thought I had life figured out: stable job, decent apartment, and a predictable routine. That was until Emma walked into my life. She was 26, radiant, intelligent, and had this magnetic charm that made me believe I could conquer the world just by standing next to her. We met through mutual friends, and from the moment our eyes locked across that crowded room, I knew she was different. Over the next year, we built something beautiful, a love so strong it felt unshakable. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. When I proposed, it wasn't some grand gesture. It was intimate, just the two of us in my living room, with her saying yes as tears streamed down her face. For the first time in my life, I felt like I'd won at everything. But beneath the surface of our happiness, cracks were forming, cracks I chose to ignore because I loved her too much to see them clearly. Her family, especially her mother, always seemed off. At first, it was subtle. A comment here, a glance there. Her mom would say things like, "It's good you're stable, Emma needs someone reliable," or "You work so hard it must be tough not having connections to lean on." The words sounded innocent enough, but they carried an undertone of judgment, like she saw me as inadequate. Her dad, he was quieter, almost passive, deferring every decision to her mom without question. And then there were her brothers, younger than her but acting like overzealous guardians, glaring at me during family dinners as if I were plotting to kidnap their sister. I tried to brush it off. After all, families can be complicated, right? But looking back now, those early warning signs weren't just red flags, they were neon billboards flashing "Run." Still, I convinced myself that once we were married, they'd come around. Love conquers all, doesn't it? Or so I told myself. What I didn't realize was that behind closed doors, her mother was already plotting against us. She viewed me as a threat, not because I wasn't good enough for Emma, but because I didn't fit into her vision of what Emma's future should look like. Little did I know, this quiet disapproval would soon spiral into something far darker, unraveling everything I held dear. At first, everything between Emma and me felt like a dream. We were two people who clicked effortlessly, sharing laughter, dreams, and even the mundane details of life. But dreams have a way of unraveling when you least expect it, and for us, that unraveling began subtly, so subtly that I almost missed it until it was too late. It started with small things, almost imperceptible shifts in her behavior. At first, she'd ask casual questions about my day, which seemed normal enough. But then those questions became more probing, more frequent. "Who did you have lunch with?" Or "Why didn't you text me back during your break?" These weren't just idle curiosities, they carried an undertone of suspicion, as if she were trying to piece together some hidden narrative about my life. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to wedding stress. After all, planning a future together isn't easy, and maybe she was just anxious. But the tension grew thicker with each passing week. One evening, I came home from work to find her sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone with an unreadable expression. When I asked what was wrong, she shrugged and said nothing, but her eyes told a different story. They darted toward me, then away, as if she were weighing whether to say something, or worse, as if she already knew something I didn't. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Little did I know, my instincts were right. A few days later, I discovered the truth, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a chilling moment that made me feel like I was living in some twisted spy thriller. I had been working late in my home office, going over spreadsheets for an upcoming project. Exhausted, I decided to call it a night and headed to bed, leaving my laptop open on the desk. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee, I noticed something strange. Papers on my desk were slightly out of place, and my laptop, which I always closed before leaving the room, was shut tight. At first, I thought I might have forgotten to close it, but then I saw a faint smudge on the trackpad, one that hadn't been there the night before. My stomach sank. Someone had been in my office while I slept. And deep down, I already knew who it was. That evening, I confronted Emma. "Did you go into my office last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She froze, her fork halfway to her mouth, before stammering, "No, why would I do that?" Her denial only confirmed my suspicions. I pressed further. Because my laptop was moved, and there's a fingerprint on the trackpad. Did you touch it? She looked away, her face pale. I wanted to check something, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Check what? I demanded, my frustration bubbling over. You don't trust me anymore, is that it? She didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. In that moment, I realized how far we'd drifted from the foundation of trust we once shared. What had started as harmless curiosity had morphed into paranoia, fueled by whispers from her family and her own insecurities. Emma wasn't just questioning my actions, she was dissecting them, searching for evidence of betrayal where none existed. It was suffocating, like walking on eggshells in my own home. Every move I made felt scrutinized, every word I said analyzed for hidden meaning. Looking back, I should have seen it as a red flag, a glaring warning sign that our relationship was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. But at the time, I convinced myself it was just a phase, a temporary lapse in judgment brought on by external pressures. I told myself that love could overcome anything, even misplaced suspicion. What I failed to realize was that this wasn't just about trust, it was about control. Emma's actions weren't driven by love or concern. They were driven by fear, manipulation, and the toxic influence of her family. And as the days turned into weeks, that fear began to consume her and, ultimately, the day Emma confronted me with those grainy, low-quality photos was the day my world started to unravel. It wasn't just a conversation, it was an ambush, a calculated attack designed to strip away everything I thought we had built together. She walked into my apartment that afternoon like a storm cloud ready to burst, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as if it were evidence in a courtroom drama. The air felt heavy, charged with tension, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. Instead, she stopped just inside the doorway, her eyes blazing with accusation. We need to talk, she said, her voice trembling but sharp enough to cut through steel. Those four words, so simple, yet so devastating, sent a chill down my spine. I knew instantly this wasn't going to be one of our usual disagreements. This was something darker, more final. I put down what I was doing and turned to face her, trying to keep my tone calm. Okay, what's up? I asked, though deep down, I already sensed the answer wouldn't be easy. Without warning, she shoved her phone into my face, the screen displaying blurry images of me leaving a restaurant with Sarah, a coworker. My stomach dropped. The photos were laughably bad, pixelated, distorted, and utterly meaningless, but the look on Emma's face told me she saw them as damning proof of betrayal. Care to explain this? She spat, her voice rising with every syllable. For a second, I couldn't even process what I was seeing. That's Sarah, I said finally, my voice steady despite the chaos brewing inside me. We had lunch last week to discuss a project. That's it, but Emma wasn't listening. Her jaw tightened, her hands balled into fists at her sides, and then came the words that hit me harder than any punch ever could. If you can't give me a clear explanation right now, this is over. I mean it. Her voice cracked on the last sentence, but there was no mistaking the resolve behind it. She pulled the engagement ring off her finger, the same ring I'd given her during that intimate moment months ago, and held it up between us like a weapon. You've been lying to me this whole time, she hissed, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. Before I could respond, she hurled the ring onto the floor with such force that it skidded across the hardwood and disappeared under the couch. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the ring had landed, my mind struggling to catch up with the surreal scene unfolding before me. How had we gone from planning a future together to this? 1 minute, I was defending myself against baseless accusations, and the next, she was walking out the door without a backward glance. The sound of it slamming shut echoed through the apartment, leaving behind a silence so deafening it felt suffocating. I wanted to run after her, to make her understand, but my legs refused to move. All I could do was stand there, overwhelmed by a mix of disbelief, frustration, and heartbreak. I realized how carefully orchestrated the entire confrontation must have been. Those photos weren't just random, they were planted, deliberately crafted to destroy my credibility. And Emma, whether knowingly or not, had become a pawn in her mother's twisted game. But in that moment, all I knew was that the woman I loved had turned on me completely, abandoning years of trust in favor of blind suspicion. It was a betrayal unlike anything I'd ever experienced, and it left me questioning not only our relationship but also my own worth. The sound of fists pounding on my door shattered the fragile silence that had settled after Emma's accusations. At first, I thought it was just another angry neighbor complaining about noise. After all, who else would be banging on my door at this hour? But then the pounding grew louder, more aggressive, until the wood groaned under the force of each blow. My heart sank as I realized this wasn't a random disturbance, it was deliberate, calculated even. Before I could react, the door burst open with a deafening crack, splintering at the hinges like it was made of matchsticks. And there they were, Emma's dad and her two brothers, their faces contorted with rage, their eyes blazing with a mix of fury and righteousness. What happened next felt like something out of a nightmare. They didn't just barge in, they stormed into my apartment like an invading army, armed not only with clenched fists but also with baseball bats. Yes, baseball bats. The sight of them sent a jolt of panic through me, but before I could process what was happening, Emma's dad stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You think you can mess with my daughter's heart and get away with it, you piece of trash," he snarled, jabbing a finger at me. His words hit harder than any punch ever could because they carried the weight of judgment not just from him, but from the entire family. Before I could respond, one of her brothers lunged at me, swinging his bat with a ferocity that screamed premeditation. I stumbled back, raising my hands instinctively to shield myself, but it was no use. The first blow landed squarely on my jaw, sending a searing pain shooting through my skull. Another followed, this time aimed at my ribs, and I crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. Through the haze of pain, I caught glimpses of Emma standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with cold detachment. Her presence, or rather, her absence of intervention, was worse than any physical blow. How could she stand there and let this happen? How could she watch while her own family turned my home into a war zone? The room spun around me as the assault continued. Each strike felt like a hammer against steel, relentless and merciless. One brother grabbed me by the collar, slamming me against the wall hard enough to knock over a lamp. Glass shattered, shards scattering across the floor like glittering reminders of how quickly my life had unraveled. Blood trickled down my face, warm and sticky, mingling with the metallic taste of fear in my mouth. My body screamed in agony, every nerve ending ablaze, but the worst part wasn't the physical pain, it was the betrayal. It was seeing Emma, the woman I loved, standing idly by as her family destroyed everything we built together. Eventually, the blows stopped coming, though whether out of exhaustion or satisfaction, I couldn't tell. As consciousness slipped away, I lay there amidst the wreckage of my living room, overturned furniture, broken glass, and streaks of blood staining the carpet. When I finally came to, hours later, the reality of what had happened crashed over me like a tidal wave. My head throbbed, my ribs ached with every shallow breath, and my vision blurred as tears welled up in my eyes. For the first time in my life, I felt truly powerless, like a pawn in someone else's twisted game. It was a week after the police report had been filed, and I was still reeling from everything that had happened. My apartment was slowly coming back together, broken furniture replaced, shattered glass swept away, but the emotional wreckage felt insurmountable. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Emma's face as she stood there in my doorway, arms crossed, watching her family tear me apart. It wasn't just betrayal, it was complicity. She hadn't lifted a finger to stop them, and now she wanted to act like none of it mattered. But then came the call that would change everything. The number wasn't saved in my phone, but when I answered, a voice on the other end said, "We need to talk." It was Uncle Joe, Emma's uncle, a man I barely knew. He sounded nervous, almost apologetic, and suggested we meet at a diner off the highway. The location alone screamed secrecy, like something out of a spy movie. When I arrived, he was already sitting in a booth, fidgeting with a napkin. As soon as I slid into the seat across from him, he leaned forward and whispered, "You deserve to know the truth." And oh, what a truth it was. What followed felt like a scene straight out of a psychological thriller. Uncle Joe explained that this whole mess wasn't some random misunderstanding or heat-of-the-moment decision, it was a meticulously orchestrated plot. Her mom, the same woman who had always masked her disdain for me behind polite smiles, had hired a private investigator to follow me for months. Months. This wasn't just casual distrust, it was surveillance, obsession even. The spy had been tasked with collecting every tiny detail about my life, no matter how insignificant, to build a narrative that painted me as unfaithful. Grainy photos of me leaving work late, check. A coworker waving goodbye in the parking lot, check. Even mundane coffee runs were twisted into evidence of infidelity. Uncle Joe handed me a USB drive containing texts, emails, and receipts proving the entire setup. There were messages between her mom and the spy discussing angles, timing, and even coaching Emma on how to confront me. She wanted Emma to marry someone else, Uncle Joe admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. Someone rich, connected, someone who fit her vision of perfection. You were never good enough in her eyes. As I scrolled through the files later that night, my blood boiled. Each document was a dagger, slicing deeper into any lingering hope I'd had that this was all some terrible mistake. The lies weren't just aimed at ruining my relationship with Emma, they were designed to destroy me completely. And Emma, she had fallen for it hook, line, and sinker. When I confronted her later via text, because I couldn't stomach seeing her face, she didn't deny it. Instead, she tried to justify herself. "I didn't have a choice," she wrote, her words dripping with self-pity. "My mom made me believe you were lying. She convinced me those pictures were real. Real. Those grainy, laughably amateurish photos. How could anyone with half a brain think they proved anything?" But the worst part wasn't her gullibility, it was her refusal to take responsibility. "You should understand why I did what I did," she pleaded. Understand. After everything her family had done to me, she expected me to empathize. Her excuses only fueled my anger. Didn't she realize how much damage her blind trust in her mother had caused? Didn't she see that by choosing to believe those lies, she had become an accomplice to their cruelty? I wanted to scream at her, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain I'd endured. But instead, I deleted her message without responding. Some wounds run too deep for words to heal. I realized that Emma's reaction, or lack thereof, was the final nail in the coffin. She wasn't sorry for letting her family assault me, she was sorry she'd been caught. Her apology wasn't about remorse, it was about saving face. And that realization hit me harder than any punch ever could. The woman I once loved, the person I thought I knew inside and out, was gone. In her place was someone weak, manipulable, and unwilling to stand up for what was right. By the time Emma's family realized how deep they were in, it was already too late. The police had issued warrants, charges were filed, and their once untouchable facade was crumbling faster than they could rebuild it. But desperation has a way of making people do reckless things, and that's exactly what happened next. They didn't just try to reason with me, they tried to buy me off. And when that failed, they resorted to threats, crossing lines I never thought they'd dare cross. It started subtly enough, like everything else they'd done. A cousin of Emma's whom I barely knew, a guy I'd only met once at some Christmas party, showed up unannounced in my office parking lot. He approached me with this fake friendly smile, hands raised as if he were surrendering. "Hey man, can we talk?" he said, his tone dripping with forced casualness. My stomach tightened instantly. I knew this wasn't about catching up over coffee. Still, I stopped walking and crossed my arms, waiting for him to get to the point. "They feel awful about what happened," he began, his voice low but urgent. "No one wants this to go to court. Look, they're willing to cover your medical bills, maybe throw in a settlement. If you drop the charges." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed just how entitled these people were. Did they really think money could erase everything they'd done, that I'd trade justice for a paycheck? I stared at him, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Tell them I'm not interested," I finally said, my voice cold and steady. They can explain themselves in court. The cousin shifted awkwardly, clearly unprepared for my refusal. Look, man, a trial is going to get messy for everyone, he pressed, his tone sharpening slightly. You sure you want that kind of attention? That's when the thinly veiled threat came. Besides, he added, leaning closer, do you really want people digging into your life? Things getting out on social media, trust me, no one wins here. My blood ran cold. Was he seriously implying they'd spread lies about me online if I didn't back down? It was a new low, even for them. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms, but I kept my composure. You tell them this, I said, stepping closer so there was no mistaking the steel in my voice. If they think they can intimidate me, they've got another thing coming. The cousin left looking frustrated, but that wasn't the end of it. A few days later, my phone buzzed incessantly with unknown numbers calling and texting. At first, I ignored them, assuming it was more of the same. But then something worse happened. A call came directly to my workplace. Someone claiming to be a family friend spoke to HR under the guise of concern, alleging that I was involved in some sort of scandal. They hinted at fabricated stories about misconduct, trying to paint me as someone unstable or unreliable. It was a calculated move, designed to undermine me professionally while putting pressure on me personally. When I found out about the call, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How far were they willing to go to protect themselves? Did they truly believe destroying my career would make me cave? What scared me most wasn't the attempt itself, it was the realization that they saw me as expendable, someone whose reputation could be trampled without consequence. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if this affected my job? What if their lies gained traction before the truth could surface? But then I remembered why I'd come this far. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about standing up against people who thought they could manipulate others without accountability. If I backed down now, it wouldn't just be my loss, it would validate everything they stood for. So I reported the incident to my lawyer, who assured me we'd address it during the trial. Until then, I focused on staying strong, refusing to let fear dictate my actions. The cafe near the courthouse was quiet, almost eerily so, with only a few patrons scattered around. I had agreed to meet Emma one last time not because I wanted closure, but because my lawyer insisted it might help solidify the case if she admitted anything incriminating in front of a witness. Still, as I sat there waiting, my stomach churned with unease. This wasn't about reconciliation, this was about accountability. When Emma walked in, though, all thoughts of strategy vanished. She looked broken. Her hair wasn't kempt, her eyes red and swollen from what must have been hours of crying. The confident woman I once knew was gone, replaced by someone who seemed fragile, desperate, and utterly lost. She slid into the seat across from me without saying a word, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse like it was a lifeline. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt suffocating, heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, she broke down, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't know they'd go this far." "I swear I didn't." Her voice cracked on every syllable, each word laced with raw emotion. It would have been easy to feel pity for her if not for the memories of her standing idly by while her family destroyed me. "I thought you loved me," I said finally, my tone colder than I intended. "If you truly cared, you would have asked me for the truth instead of believing those fake photos. You chose them over me, Emma. That's not love." Her sobs grew louder, drawing glances from the other customers. "You don't understand," she cried, slamming her fists on the table hard enough to make the cups rattle. "My mom made me believe you were lying. She told me you were cheating, that you didn't care about me anymore. What was I supposed to think? What you should have done," I shot back, leaning forward, "was trust me. Instead, you let your family manipulate you and then you stood there while they beat me senseless in my own home. Does that sound like love to you?" For a second, she froze, her face pale as the weight of my words hit her. But then something inside her snapped. She stood abruptly, knocking over her chair in the process. "How dare you judge me?" she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. Heads turned throughout the cafe, conversations halting mid-sentence as everyone stared at us. Do you have any idea how hard this has been for me? My life is ruined because of you. Because of me? I repeated incredulously, rising to my feet now too. You're seriously blaming me for this mess? Your mom orchestrated the whole thing, Emma. She hired someone to follow me, took those fake pictures, and convinced you I was guilty. And you just went along with it. Emma's expression twisted into something unrecognizable: anger, guilt, and desperation colliding in a storm of emotions. Before I could react, she grabbed a butter knife from the table and pressed it against her wrist. If you leave, I'll do it, she hissed, her voice trembling but deadly serious. I'll hurt myself, and it'll be your fault. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on us. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was exactly what she wanted: a reaction, a reason to shift the blame onto me. Put the knife down, Emma, I said firmly, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. This isn't going to change anything. You don't care about me. She shrieked, tears streaming faster now. You never did. That's where you're wrong, I replied, stepping back toward the door. I cared enough to fight for the truth, but you gave up on us the moment you stopped trusting me. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there amidst the chaos she had created. As I stepped outside, I heard her scream behind me, followed by gasps from the crowd. I didn't look back. Some battles aren't worth fighting, and some wounds run too deep to heal. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation, as if everyone present could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. I sat in the front row, my hands clasped tightly together, trying to steady my breathing. My lawyer had warned me that this day would be emotionally draining, but nothing could have prepared me for the spectacle that followed. On one side of the room were Emma's family, her mom looking defiant despite the mounting evidence against her. Her dad and brothers exchanging nervous glances, while Uncle Joe sat quietly, his head bowed as though he carried the guilt of the entire ordeal on his shoulders. When the prosecutor began presenting the case, it felt like watching a house of cards collapse under its own lies. The text messages between Emma's mom and the private investigator were damning, painting a clear picture of manipulation and premeditation. Photos of my injuries from the night of the attack were displayed on a large screen, each bruise a stark reminder of their brutality. But the piece de resistance was the USB drive containing all the emails and instructions her mom had sent to orchestrate the fake affair narrative. It was overwhelming, not just for me, but for anyone who witnessed it. Then came the defense's turn, and that's when things spiraled into chaos. Emma's mom took the stand first, attempting to play the victim card with practiced ease. I only wanted to protect my daughter, she said, her voice trembling theatrically. I never intended for anyone to get hurt. Her words dripped with insincerity, and even some members of the jury exchanged skeptical looks. But the real bombshell dropped when she tried to shift the blame entirely onto Uncle Joe. He knew everything, she exclaimed, pointing an accusatory finger at him. He should have stopped me. He's the one who told you about the plan, isn't he? Clearly, he has ulterior motives. Uncle Joe visibly flinched at her words, his face pale as the gravity of her betrayal sank in. She wasn't just denying responsibility, she was throwing him under the bus to save herself. The tension in the room escalated as whispers erupted among the spectators. For a moment, it seemed like Uncle Joe might break down right there in the courtroom. Instead, he leaned forward, his jaw clenched, and muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "You'll regret this." The final blow came when the verdict was announced. As the judge declared her dad and brothers guilty of aggravated assault, bailiffs moved swiftly to handcuff them. They resisted, shouting protests about how they were just protecting their family, but their cries fell on deaf ears. Meanwhile, Emma's mom was convicted of conspiracy, her carefully constructed facade crumbling before our eyes. When the gavel struck the bench, sealing their fates, she let out a strangled gasp and collapsed onto the floor, unconscious. Panic ensued as paramedics rushed in to revive her, creating a scene so chaotic it felt more like a soap opera than a courtroom drama. As I watched her being carried out on a stretcher, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: relief, anger, and a strange sense of closure. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind would take far longer to heal. In the weeks following the trial, life didn't magically return to normal. The bruises on my body healed, but the emotional scars lingered, a constant reminder of how quickly trust could be shattered and how easily people could turn against you when fueled by fear or manipulation. What surprised me most, though, was the sudden media attention. Reporters began calling almost immediately after the verdict hit the news. They wanted interviews, exclusive stories, even photos of me standing outside the courthouse. One journalist described my case as a modern-day David versus Goliath, while another called it a cautionary tale about family dynamics gone wrong. At first, I considered saying yes. After all, who wouldn't want their story heard? But deep down, I knew that wasn't what I needed. This wasn't about fame or vindication. It was about survival, resilience, and reclaiming control over my own life. I declined every request, politely but firmly. Some reporters persisted, showing up at my apartment unannounced or leaving messages promising life-changing opportunities if I agreed to speak with them. It felt invasive, like they were trying to exploit my pain for clicks and headlines. I didn't owe anyone an explanation, let alone strangers looking to profit off my misery. Instead, I retreated into solitude, focusing on rebuilding myself piece by piece. Therapy became a lifeline during those early months, helping me process everything I'd endured: the betrayal, the violence, the sheer absurdity of it all. Slowly, I started regaining fragments of the person I used to be before Emma and her toxic family walked into my life. But something inside me refused to let the experience fade into obscurity. I couldn't shake the feeling that this ordeal had happened for a reason, that maybe, just maybe, sharing my story could help others facing similar situations. So, one quiet evening, sitting alone in my now-repaired living room, I opened my laptop and began typing. At first, it was cathartic, a way to pour out everything I'd been holding back. But as the words flowed, I realized this wasn't just for me anymore. This was bigger than revenge or closure. It was about empowerment. I titled the document "Standing Tall: How I Survived Betrayal, Lies, and Family Warfare." Writing the book wasn't easy. There were days when reliving the memories brought me to tears, forcing me to step away from the keyboard and take long walks to clear my head. Other times, anger bubbled to the surface, raw and unfiltered, as I recounted Emma's cold detachment or her mother's calculated cruelty. Yet, through it all, I kept reminding myself why I started this journey: not to dwell on the past, but to inspire change. Each chapter delved deeper into the lessons I learned, the importance of setting boundaries, recognizing red flags, and refusing to let anyone diminish your worth. I included excerpts from the text messages and emails uncovered during the investigation, not to shame anyone, but to highlight how far people will go to manipulate those they claim to love. When the manuscript was finally complete, I sent it off to a few publishers, half expecting rejection. To my surprise, several expressed interest within weeks. One editor wrote back saying, "Your story isn't just compelling, it's necessary. People need to hear this." Those words stayed with me long after I signed the contract. Months later, when the book hit shelves, I braced myself for backlash. Would Emma's family retaliate? Would they try to discredit me again? Surprisingly, there was no response, at least none that reached me directly. Perhaps they realized fighting back would only draw more attention to their crimes. The feedback from readers, however, was overwhelming. Messages poured in from strangers thanking me for giving voice to their struggles. A young woman wrote about escaping her manipulative partner, crediting my book for giving her the courage to leave. Another shared how she confronted her overbearing parents after reading about Uncle Joe's bravery in exposing the truth. Their stories reminded me why I chose to share mine, not for validation, but to spark hope in others. Looking back now, I see how far I've come. The man who once believed he'd lost everything has built a new life filled with purpose and strength. Justice may have been served, but the real victory lies in knowing I stood up for myself and inspired others to do the same. My battle with Emma's family taught me that no matter how dark things seem, there's always light waiting on the other side. You just have to fight for it.